Hello and welcome to the Starting Necron series, where we go from your first purchase to your first 2000 point army list and everything in between for the Necron forces. In this video we'll be looking at the fast attack choices for the Necron army, and the fast attack choices are rather deep and powerful for the Necrons, so there's a lot to cover in this video, and it's a unit type where you'll see a lot of different units seeing play within tournaments. The following list is from the most commonly seen units to the least commonly seen units, so it's not necessarily indicative of how powerful every unit is in terms of raw strength, but rather it's a show of how versatile and how much utility a unit might have along with their power levels in comparison to other units within the list. And as such, the first unit on the list is one that's not necessarily a power unit in terms of raw strength, but rather one that's very efficient and a very good utility unit to have in lists, and as such it sees the most amount of play across different lists because of its low points cost and utility. And this unit is the Canoptek Scarab Swarms. The Canoptek Scarab Swarms are very cheap at 15 points per model, coming with 4 wounds, 4 attacks, and a movement of 10 inches with the fly ability that lets them take full advantage of that movement profile, which is a very good cost for what you're getting in this profile alone. However, on the downside, they only have a weapon skill of 4 and a strength and toughness profile of 3. However, many other armies do have a toughness 3 profile on the bulk of their troops, even though they're tier 1 or S tier armies, so that shouldn't really disqualify them as much as just say that they are a little more fragile than you would think. More so, they only have a 6+ normal save, so in a lot of cases, if your opponent has any kind of armor penetration, they won't be getting a save, so they can only really rely on their wound profile as well as their toughness and ability to move behind cover before being shot at. Although their weapon skill is only 4 and their strength is 3, their melee weapon does auto wound if they roll a 6 to hit, and considering how many attacks you get, that ability can add up rather quickly. More so, they have things like living metal and reanimation protocols that help with the rather weak saves by giving them a little more longevity if the unit isn't wiped out altogether in one shooting or melee phase. Scarab Swarms also have a unique stratagem that costs 1 command point and lets a single swarm self-destruct in the combat phase, where you remove 1 model from the unit and roll a d6, dealing d3 mortal wounds on a roll of 2 to 5, or dealing all 3 mortal wounds on an unmodified roll of 6 to a unit that is within engagement range of the Scarab model that is ultimately removed. This is a good way to generate mortal wounds on demand, and it only costs you 1 command point and 1 model worth 15 points for the entire model. So as a whole, even though it is a little bit command point intensive and does start eating away at your Scarab Swarms, considering that on average you'll be dealing 2 mortal wounds and in many cases you might be dealing 3 mortal wounds, it's actually very efficient against certain targets where you wouldn't really want to use against generic troops, but if you're targeting a large model where the mortal wounds start to add up rather quickly, this is definitely something that you can consider by not only slowing the model down but potentially destroying it using your Scarab Swarms in this manner. I should also mention that the Scarab Swarms also have the Canoptek keyword, and as all other Canoptek models, they have the Enslaved Protector stratagem, which says for 1 command point they can perform a heroic intervention as if they were a character. This is especially good on them as they are very much a unit that wants to be a speed bump in that sense, and as such this ability goes very far on them in comparison to some other units where it does rather well, but the Scarabs can definitely take it to a whole nother level simply because they can perform their duty of screening incredibly well using this ability when they need to. In the end, the Scarab Swarm is a rather simple unit, but a very good one, being low cost for what you get and doing everything it pretty much wants to do. They also go very well with Canoptek Spiders, but that's a topic for the Elites video, and we'll cover that in that video when we get to it. So at the end of the day, while the Scarabs aren't necessarily a power unit, they bring a lot to the table, and they cost so few points that it becomes rather hard not to take a few of them to an army list when you can, because at the very least they can hold objectives and be a very big nuisance for your opponent considering how little they cost. Now, where the Canoptek Scarabs are a utility unit, the second unit on the list is more of a power unit, being the Canoptek Wraiths. The Wraiths are also a fantastic unit for their cost, being a serious threat on the tabletop. To start off, the Wraiths have a point cost of 35 points and come with a 12-inch movement speed, a toughness of 5, 3 wounds, and a 3+ normal save, as well as having a built-in 4+ invulnerable save thanks to their Wraith forms that also lets them move through units and terrain as if they had flying in a certain sense. This is actually a very durable profile at a very fast moving speed considering the amount of points you pay for it. However, that's not all they bring to the table, because for offensive capabilities, they come with a 4+ weapon skill and a ballistic skill, as well as a strength 4 and an attack profile of 4. This is further augmented with their Vicious Claws, which they come standard with, as well as being one of the more popular weapon choices for them, and the Vicious Claws bring up their strength profile up to 6 with an armor penetration of 2 and a damage profile of 2. These Vicious Claws make them an incredibly brutal unit within combat that is incredibly hard to destroy and will put out serious damage to any opponents that get into combat with them. Something to consider though is that the Vicious Vicious Claws aren't the only weapons they have, and they can actually have other weapons that allow them to adapt to the meta depending on how things change within the meta. For additional weapons, they have such weapons as the Whip Coils, which replace their Vicious Claws and double their number of attacks by saying they make 2 hit rolls instead of 1 whenever they make an attack, but only have 1 armor penetration and a damage characteristic of 1. And if you equip them with the Whip Coils, it also brings them down to their natural strength profile of 4. Normally flail weapons are rather desirable, but Necrons have plenty of ways of dealing with swarms already, so generally the stronger attacks of the Vicious Claws are preferred, though if the meta ever changes to where swarm style units are a lot more popular, you can definitely take the Whip Coils in order to help deal with swarms, as all of a sudden those 4 attacks become 8. Even though they're a weaker attack, it does let you deal with small models a lot quicker. Now, if you want a unit that goes beyond just being a melee threat, they can also pick up shooting weapons in addition to their melee options. The first option is a Particle Caster, which costs 5 points and gives them a 12-inch pistol that has 2 shots and a strength of 6, but no armor penetration and only a damage characteristic of 1. This makes it a rather underwhelming option as it stands, and would only really matter if you're trying to clear out lots of weak units, where you would take it alongside the Whip Coils and basically just provide as many attacks as you could in hopes of just taking off models off the table that don't really have a good armor save or a particularly good toughness characteristic. The second range option, however, is a little bit better, being the Transdimensional Beamer, which is a 12-inch assault weapon with only 1 shot at a strength of 4, but it does have 3 armor penetration and a damage characteristic of 3. Though this one does cost 10 points and is probably a bit too expensive as it drives up the cost significantly on a unit that is otherwise aggressively costed, and this is why you don't really see any of the range weapons on the Wraiths as often in tournament play, because they're kind of awkward, as the strength profile on the pistol weapon should really be on the assault weapon, giving it more ability to do damage to heavier armor targets due to its high armor penetration and damage profile, whereas the pistol weapon should have had the lower strength of the assault weapon so that it stayed more in theme of destroying weaker models. I guess the idea maybe was that you inversely mix and match with the Whip Coils and the Vicious Claws so that you give the Wraiths more utility, though in both cases the range weapons are rather expensive for what they bring, though generally you're just going to be fine with the melee weapons of the race, and there's not much reason to take the shooting weapons. Oh well, maybe someday they'll get updated to be a little bit more desirable. On the bright side for the shooting weapons though, the Wraith does have an ability called Slinking Strikes, which lets the Wraith fall back and still shoot or charge after falling back. This definitely makes a Transdimensional Beamer a little bit more of an option, but the Wraiths are perfectly capable of putting out a ton of damage with their Vicious Claws alone, and don't forget, if you fall back and you can still charge, you can definitely take advantage of some of the abilities that give you bonuses when you make a charge move. So it's definitely something to consider, as it's not only a shooting ability, it's still one that can let you charge, as you can fall back, charge in, and gain the bonuses of a charge ability after doing so. It's a lot more intricate than people give it credit for, and all of this adds up to make the Wraith a very powerful unit. And as a whole, this is why the Wraith is such a powerful unit, because their cost is rather low, and this is why you'll actually see the Wraiths in most armies, because they kind of have everything going for them, from being a rather fast moving unit to being very durable and putting out incredibly good damage for what you're paying for the unit. I might be a little redundant in repeating all of this again and again, but I just want to punctuate that the Wraith is very, very good for its cost, and you should definitely consider them whenever building any type of list. Now, while I'll always sing the praises of the Canoptek Wraith and the Canoptek Scarabs, in third place we have a unit known as the Triarch Praetorians, and I'm not sure how I feel about these guys, as they're a fast-moving and rather hard-hitting unit, but at the same time they feel rather expensive for how fragile they are when you think about it. That being said, they see plenty of tournament play, so I'm probably undervaluing their strength, because I prefer more of a survivability unit than I do a heavy-hitting unit. The good part about the Praetorians is that they move a total of 10 inches in their movement phase, have the fly keyword which lets them take a little more advantage of that movement speed, and bring 3 attacks each, while carrying a weapon known as the Rod of the Covenant that has a melee profile of strength 5, 3 armor penetration, and 2 damage, while also having a shooting profile of assault 1 with a 12-inch range and the same stats in terms of strength, damage, and armor penetration as the melee profile does. This can really let them do a lot of damage and get into position rather quickly. On the negative side of the Praetorians though, is that they're worth 25 points per model, so that if you take a unit of 10 of them, they'll cost you a total of 250 points, or 1/8 of your army at 2,000 points for that squad of 10, while only having a save characteristic of 3+, with no invulnerable save or feel no pain save. They do at least have a toughness of 5 and a wound profile of 2, but neither is that amazing, although neither is bad, as it's just decent. So they're not the easiest unit to destroy, as they can actually survive a decent amount of shooting, but it would be rather good to have some kind of invulnerable save, or at least a feel no pain on these guys, as a block of 10 of these is a rather desirable target for your opponent, considering that they really have to be in melee to do a lot of the damage that they can do. I also want to mention that they do not benefit from the dynastic codes, as they're only dynastic agents, which should be kept in mind, as that keeps you from gaining using some of the special abilities that the Dynastic Codes offer in order to help increase their strength, whereas something like the Canoptek Wraiths do get those abilities, making them have a little more mileage for what you get in their points value. Something else that the Praetorians can do is they can exchange their Rod of the Covenant for a Particle Caster and a Void Blade. However, the Particle Caster has no armor penetration, though it does have a pistol profile and a strength of 6 with only a damage of 1. The Void Blade is more comparable to the Rod of the Covenant, though while it mostly has the same profile as the Rod, it only has a damage profile of 1 while gaining 1 extra attack in combat. I can see in the scenario that if damage reduction becomes very common, the Void Blade might be more popular, though the shooting profile of the caster is much more underwhelming compared to the Rod of the Covenant, with the only serious perk being that it's a pistol and can shoot in combat. And finally, the last ability that the Triarch Praetorians have is that they have a stratagem called Judgment of the Triarch, which lets them gain +1 to hit on attacks in either the shooting or fight phase for a total cost of 1 command point. It's not a bad stratagem, it's just alright, but it's something that can be very important depending what kind of situation you find yourself in within a certain round of combat or even potentially shooting where you really want to make sure that your attacks land. As a whole, even though these guys see a lot of tournament play, I'm not sold on them, but the data does say otherwise, and it seems they've been performing rather well within tournament play as a whole, seeing appearances in top 4 lists as well as lists within the top 10 of larger tournaments. For me, it's more about them not being as durable or long range as I'd like for their points cost, though for those of you who like very assault style units, they will probably be a lot of fun to play, and I'm sure the people who enjoy that kind of playstyle will enjoy them a lot more than I do. There's nothing wrong with this unit, it's just kind of a difference of preference of playstyle, I guess. In 4th place, we have a unit that I think is probably a little undervalued at this time, being the Tomb Blades. I probably like these guys more than I should, as I was rather harsh on the Praetorians when these guys are even more expensive. However, they trade damage output for survivability, speed, and range, all of which makes them a unit I enjoy more than the melee style Praetorians, who are a bit more fragile than these guys. To start off with, the Tomb Blade costs a total of 25 points baseline and has a toughness characteristic of 5 with only a 4+ save, but they also have an incredibly fast movement speed of 14 inches, which is faster than any other unit we've seen so far outside of flyers. In addition to all of this, they have a built-in ability that gives enemies -1 to hit with shooting attacks. Their preferred ranged weapon is known as the Twin Gauss Blaster, which drives them up to a total of 30 points, but has a 30-inch range with a rapid profile of 2 and has 2 armor penetration, but only a damage characteristic of 1. They can also swap this out for a Particle Beamer or a Twin Tesla Carbine, but neither is that impressive and only really works in a meta where armor penetration doesn't matter, as neither of those weapons have any armor penetration, nor do they go beyond the strength 5 or damage characteristic of 1 of the Gauss Blaster. So as a whole, you're banking on the number of shots with them, not the stats, and that's just not a world we're in right now, but who knows, maybe if the meta changes, those other weapons can become a little more popular. Now, what really drives up the survivability of this unit is that for 5 points a model, you can give any models you desire a 5+ invulnerable save using the Shadow Loom, and you should probably take this on every single Tomb Blade since it gives them a significant boost in survivability, giving them a lot of ability to survive attacks that they otherwise normally wouldn't. More so, for another 3 points on any model, you can take the Shield Veins, which turns their 4+ save into a 3+ save. You don't have to take this on each model, and generally if you take a large enough unit, you only want this on a handful of models to soak damage as needed against low armor penetration fire, while you let the other models, which only have a 4+ normal save but are taking vulnerable saves of 5+, take the damage so that you can preserve your 3+ save models in order to tank weaker shots. The Tomb Blades can also take a Nebula Scope, which lets the bearer ignore cover benefits of enemy models for a total of 3 points a model, but as this only applies to the model carrying this item, and it can't be taken alongside the important Shadow Loom, it's generally not worth it due to the price and restrictions of keeping you from getting that invulnerable save. Maybe in the future if they decouple it, I can see it maybe seeing play, but most of the time armies have one item that just goes on the squad and gives the entire squad the benefit for 5 points, versus having to have each model equipped with a 3-point item that gives it a very marginal benefit. It should also be mentioned that they not only benefit from the fly ability, but also gain access to the Dynastic Codes, which can really bring up their power level even if you're paying 35 to 38 points a model once you fully upgrade the survivability and weapons of the model. One other oddity is that they're a core unit as well, so they benefit from core abilities such as the Night Scythe being able to teleport them into play out of reserves, which probably isn't that relevant, but it's an interesting keyword to have nonetheless. As for unique stratagems, they have one called Fractal Targeting, which lets them pick one of 2 abilities in the shooting phase for 1 command point. The first of these abilities is that all of their rapid fire weapons function as Assault 2, which is nice when you want to go faster and advance while still being able to shoot at essentially full capacity with their Gauss Blasters. The second option is that they do not suffer any penalty for advancing and shooting an assault weapon, which their other 2 weapons are. This is very much one of those stratagems that exists and will sometimes find use, but is mostly not that interesting and only really has one mode currently, considering you're going to have the Gauss Blaster on them, which is the rapid fire weapon, so all it really does is allow them to advance and shoot their weapons, which can be rather powerful considering they're already moving 14 inches in 1 turn, so being able to move in advance and then still shoot is a rather strong ability when you need it to be, though in other cases it might not be relevant at all if you're not taking advantage of the advancement profile or of the shooting profile in that situation. As a whole, I really like this unit, but maybe it could use a minor points decrease as it's very fast and has good survivability, but doesn't always have the output that you want it to have. It's definitely a unit that will be a hassle for your opponents, though with the smaller board sizes, it might just need a minor tweak to really shine and overtake the Praetorians in the popularity of how often these units see play. Though even as it stands, the unit does see a decent amount of play and is definitely a fun unit to play if you enjoy that type of playstyle. Coming in last for the fast attack choices in 5th place is the Ophydian Destroyers. These guys have a really nice model and remind me of the old school Wraiths that the Necrons had, and that's a bit of a nostalgia that's nice to experience. However, most of the Necron models are rather nice models, to be honest. In reality, the Ophydians aren't bad, they're just not as powerful when compared to other choices, with the easy comparison being the Canoptek Wraiths. Both the Ophydian Destroyers and the Canoptek Wraiths cost a total of 35 points, but have reasonably different stats despite filling somewhat of the same role within the army. Where the Ophydians do better than the Wraiths is that they have a 3+ weapon skill, but where they fall behind is that they only have a toughness characteristic of 4 instead of 5 like the Wraiths do. They also have 3 attacks baseline as opposed to the 4 that the Wraiths have, and they have a 4+ armor save instead of the 3+ armor save of the Wraiths. Not everything is as easy to compare, because while the Wraiths normally have vicious claws, the Ophydians have a bit of an odd weapons loadout that can be a bit annoying, which requires you to take 2 Threshers and 1 Reblade for every 3 models, similar to the Canoptek Destroyers, but the Canoptek Destroyers are also a topic for the Elites video. To take a look at the weapons, the Thresher Blades do not have any additional strength, meaning that the Ophydians are fighting at their base strength of 4, but they do have an armor penetration of 3 and a damage characteristic of 2, while giving the Ophydian an extra attack. The Reblade, on the other hand, has +2 strength, an armor penetration characteristic of 4, and a damage profile of 3, which makes it a very heavy hitting weapon, but it does not gain an extra attack like the Thresher Blade does. The Ophydians also all come with the Ophydian Claws, which give them an additional 2 attacks, but at their baseline strength, an armor penetration characteristic of 1, and a damage of 1. This means that they have more attacks overall than the Wraiths, but with a mixed profile and generally weaker output overall. The mixed profile is the oddest part, as it ranges from rather weak claws to the medium Threshers and finally to the heavy Reblades all in one unit. On one hand, it means they do okay against every target. On the other hand, they don't do great against any specific target. This is probably one of the factors that makes them so awkward, because they don't really fit any specific niche, unlike the other units where you can throw them against a specific target and do a significant amount of damage really quickly, while the Ophydians are just going to be alright against any target you throw them against, meaning that while they'll be okay, they'll also struggle a little bit as well. Now, something to mention is that the Ophydians also have a decent amount of special abilities, with the first ability being Hardwired for Destruction, that allows them to reroll hit rolls of 1. This is a common ability that most Destroyer style units have, but it's definitely a good one to have. Another ability they have is called the Hyperphase Reblades, which makes an unmodified hit roll of 6 score an additional hit with the units carrying the Reblades. This ability is just okay, as you can only have 2 Ophydians with the Reblades in a squad due to the outfitting restrictions of the weapons carried by the squad, and on average that means they'll score 1 additional hit if you have a unit of 6 of them. If you could give all 6 Ophydians Reblades, this would be a much more exciting ability and would do a lot more work in the long run, as well as making the Ophydians a much stronger choice overall. The Ophydians don't only have offensive abilities, but they also have defensive ones in the form of Whip Coil Bodies, which gives enemies -1 to hit in melee against the Ophydians. This is another ability that's just okay and doesn't really compare well with the Canoptek Wraiths 4+ Invulnerable save that is much more valuable for the amount of points that you're paying for either of these models. However, one place that the Ophydians do beat out the Canoptek Wraiths is that while the Wraiths can move through terrain and units, the Ophydians can deep strike with their Tunneling Horrors ability. They also have a special stratagem known as the Burrowing Nightmares, which lets them leave the table and deep strike back onto the table in your next reinforcement step for 1 command point. This can really push their mobility rather heavily and gives them more justification to see play. For my final thoughts on the Ophydians, I don't think they're unplayable. I think they're just competing with a lot of options at the same cost, such as the Canoptek Wraiths or even the Canoptek Destroyers, which occupy a different unit type but also have a lot of crossover in terms of what they bring to the table. That being said, I can see the Ophydians seeing some play at some point as additional Wraiths once you've maxed those out. They do have some good aspects as a whole, but the competition is very heavy for what they do as well, and while they have a lot of special abilities and weapons, all of those special abilities and weapons are just a little bit on the mediocre end and don't add up in the same kind of way that special abilities on other units such as the Cerberus Raiders of the AdMech do. So as such, the Ophydian Destroyers occupy a very awkward situation, and while they're not out of the question, they're definitely something that needs some kind of minor tweak in order to see a lot more play than they currently do. Outside of the normal codex, the Necrons have two options from the Forge World line, the first one being in the 6th place, which is the Canoptek Tomb Sentinel. The Canoptek Tomb Sentinel is a Forge World model as previously mentioned, and while I'm sure you're tired of hearing me say this by now, but it's another model that I think looks really great, but isn't that great in terms of rules. The Canoptek Tomb Sentinel isn't cheap at 125 points, but has reasonable stats with a 10-inch movement speed, a strength of 6, a toughness of 7, and a total of 9 wounds. However, the downside of the stat line is that it only has a 4+ weapon and ballistic skill, with only a 3+ normal save and no other survivability benefits in its profile. For weapons, it comes with the Exile Can, which has a reasonably short range at 18 inches, but a strength of 10, an armor penetration of 4, and a damage characteristic of 3. The number of shots are random, having d6 shots, and as such, it's a blast weapon, which is good against swarms, but this isn't a weapon you wish to target swarms with normally, and the fact that it's a blast weapon does kind of hurt the fact that the Tomb Sentinel is a monstrous creature. The Sentinel also has a melee weapon, which brings its strength up to 7, which is just shy of the important breaking point of strength 8, and this weapon has 2 armor penetration and a damage characteristic of 2. The issue is that the Tomb Sentinel only has 4 attacks total, with the claws not providing any additional attacks, which does make this a lot more limited in terms of melee capabilities. One last thing to keep in mind is that the Sentinel does have a Gloom Prism, so it can try to deny psychic powers, which is a nice perk considering Necrons don't have much interaction in the psychic phase outside of this item and the Zarkon Dynasty. This is further aided by the Sentinel having the dimensional translocation ability that allows it to deep strike, making it easier to get within range of the Gloom Prison, as well as the Exile Cannon, so that you can actually get shots off before being engaged and being locked out of range combat, with only 4 attacks being available to get you out of that melee combat. I'd like to see this unit move to the normal codex, as it does have a lot of interesting aspects and an incredibly awesome looking model, but the points cost is rather high considering it has no additional survivability, which is a big bummer considering how durable the other options in the Necron forces are that cost the same amount of points as this one. Something like the Wraith form or Quantum Shielding would go a very long way with this model, giving it some much needed love in order to allow it to be competitive, though even then the short range and the low attack profile might keep it from seeing play, but 125 points isn't the most expensive thing in the world considering what you're getting if you have some survivability to back it up with. Finally, in 7th place, we have the Canoptek Acanthrites. These are another Forge World model, and while it looks as good as the rest, it's definitely not as good as the rest of the units within the fast attack choice, although the fast attack choices are incredibly competitive, so this might just be a matter of them looking worse by comparison as opposed to them being bad in general. This unit costs a whopping 40 points per model and gives you a 12-inch movement speed with a strength and toughness characteristic of 5, as well as 3 wounds and a 3+ armor save. However, each of these models only has what essentially amounts to a Meltagun and a Void Blade. If you're in the market for a decent biker with a Meltagun-like weapon, this isn't a bad choice, but it feels like the Necrons normally have better things to do with their points if they're not intentionally planning for this kind of weapons profile and mobility. The only other ability that this unit has is that it has a Shadow Wings ability, which gives the enemies -1 to hit with their shooting attacks made against this unit. As a whole, I'm not a fan of paying 120 points for a unit of 3 of these, but there could be a situation in which you really want fast-moving Meltaguns and you want to bring these along as a result of that, but normally in most armies, this kind of thing would be less expensive, and the Necrons already have a lot of potent shooting as well as fast-moving units, so it's a little bit hard to find a place for these guys, especially at their points cost, considering that all you really get is that 3+ armor save and -1 to hit against shooting, meaning that they're a rather fragile unit even at toughness 5. Anyway, as always, if you've enjoyed the content, please remember to like, subscribe, and share, as it really does help the channel out and helps other players out by letting them see the content. And I'd like to give a big thanks to my patrons for supporting the channel. You're really awesome people. Thank you very much. And as always, whether you're a patron or not, have a great day. See you next time.